I want to welcome everybody to today's Tight Race Big Stakes webinar. The event is presented in partnership with Panjapur, the Pennsylvania, New Jersey chapter of the American Association for Public Opinion Research, and NJ.com. As Eagleton celebrates its 70th year, we invite you to visit Eagleton's website for the upcoming launch of their anniversary campaign. We'll stay tuned for more. We're thrilled to have an outstanding and all-star team of a panel of experts joining us to discuss the latest in political opinion and polling in our region. And we will, and everybody here, you can use the Q&A function to submit your questions throughout the webinar. In alphabetical order, we have Dan Cassino, the Executive Director of the Fairleigh Dickinson University's FDU poll. Dr. Cassino oversees one of the nation's leading academic survey research centers, producing statewide and national polling on politics and public affairs. He is a professor of government and politics at FDU and a frequent commentator on polling and political behavior in the media. We have Don Levy, Director of Siena University's Siena Research Institute. Dr. Levy has led Siena's polling operations for nearly 2 decades, conducting surveys on politics, business, and social trends. Under his leadership, Siena's polls have become a trusted source for insights into public opinion across the nation. And we have Ashley Koning, Director of the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling at Rutgers University's Eagleton Institute of Politics. Dr. Koning leads the center's research on public opinion, elections, and civic engagement, and is a recognized expert in New Jersey and national polling. She frequently provides analysis for major media outlets and contributes to academic and public discussions on polling and democracy. We have Alyssa Maurice, Assistant Director and Head of Research and Polling at Stockton University's William J. Hughes Center for Public Policy. Maurice manages the center's public opinion research and supports projects that connect data-driven analysis and civic and policy engagement in New Jersey and beyond. So we're going to give each of the panelists 3 minutes to introduce themselves and to talk about what they're seeing in these races and a little bit about their polling operations. And I suppose we can go alphabetically like we did, and start with Dan.
All right, so I want to talk a little about the limitations. I think we're all going to talk about some of the limitations we see on polling. And one of the big limitations we have is in the low response rates we get. It's pretty common now for our surveyors to pick up 1 person, 1.5 people out of every 100 calls. And as long as the people that are picking up the phone are a random subsample of everyone who we call, it's not a problem. The problem is when the response rates gets that low, we don't really believe anymore that it's perfectly a random subsample. And that we can fix some of that by waiting, but we can't fix all of that problem by waiting. In the last couple of days, I faced a lot of questions about what's going on in Lakewood, where the Lakewood VOD endorsed the Republican candidate Jack Ciattarelli. In 2021, they had endorsed Governor Murphy. And the question was, well, where are we going to see this in the polls? This is a block of tens of thousands of voters. Where does this come in the polls? How does this change the response we get? And the answer is it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is because among the groups that do not pick up the phone and talk to pollsters in general are people who have very strongly held religious beliefs. And almost doesn't matter if it's Christian religious belief or Jewish religious beliefs. People who are more religious are less likely to pick up the phone for whatever reason. And that means that there are whole groups, whole populations that we are missing in polling because they aren't picking up the phones. And residents of Lakewood are among those groups. We actually can see that in the data, that we get much lower response rates out of Lakewood than we get out of other similarly situated areas in New Jersey. And this is a problem overall. as long as we have lots of people who just aren't picking up the phone, then we're going to miss out on movement within them. And this isn't just for people in Lakewood or other religious groups. We also see this among, for instance, recent immigrants to the United States. It's very hard to pick up public opinion among recent immigrants because we might not be speaking the same language they are on the first ring when our caller calls. In New Jersey, some of our lowest response rates actually come from Asian Americans. So we have large Asian American communities, especially in the area sometimes called Central Jersey, despite the fact that Central Jersey doesn't exist. But the people there, Asian Americans in Central Jersey, say, are less likely to pick up the phone. So we actually have less idea of what's going on with Chinese American communities and with Indian American communities in those areas. We simply don't know. So the best polling we can possibly do is always going to be limited, but who's willing to pick up the phone? And that's not just a question of cost and of how many phone calls we have to make, but it's also a question of representation. And it's something that pollsters have been working with for a long time, but we still don't really have good answers on.
Don, you can give us a perspective from the other side of the river.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Dan pointed out one of the problems that we all face. Let me talk about another one. Likely voters. In addition to the question of response rate, we also have a question of who's actually going to show up and vote. Because when you stop and think about it, each of us as pollsters, if we conduct our poll today, anytime before Election Day, we're trying to give an estimation of a group of people who exist at a point in the future. They don't exist yet. And every poll that you pick up may very well say we talked to X number of registered voters, of whom Y number were likely voters. So another challenge that we have is to determine who actually, of those people that Dan finally gets to talk to him, are actually likely or real voters. We know, for example, in the New York City race that about a third of all registered voters are actually going to cast a vote in the upcoming election. So we work on that vociferously as pollsters. What we do at Siena is we work off the list of all registered voters. We create a sample that quotas those folks by various different demographics. We compute based on their previous vote history, a score, if you will, of how likely they are to vote. Then when we finally get them on the phone or they respond to a text to web, we ask them about their stated likelihood. We combine both of those into one single score, and we apply that as a weight the same way that you might weight by political party, by age, or by gender. We feel as though every single registered voter has a greater than zero probability to actually vote. And post-election, that's for us, it's a fun time. We find out how our model of the electorate actually match. So we're not just fighting to get people to respond to us. We're also, and every single one of us is going to come up with a different model, whether it's New Jersey or New York City. What is that actual electorate, the people who actually cast their votes, going to look like? Each and every election, there are chatter about this election is going to be different. The easiest way, of course, is to say that this electorate is going to look like the last one. But perhaps this time, young voters are going to turn out. Perhaps this time, seniors are going to turn out overwhelmingly because they're concerned about certain issues. Perhaps voters of color are going to turn out at rates greater than. So who are likely voters? How do we measure them? And who actually is going to show up on Election Day are challenges that we as pollsters continue to face.
Ashley, your turn.
So Dan and Don talked about the who we do and don't get in a sample, but it's also the how. And this is another challenge that pollsters always face in terms of how are we actually recruiting and interviewing these respondents once we get a hold of them. Back in the olden days, everything was on landline. And, before that, we could even be talking about face-to-face. And it was very common to get response rates that were in the 80, 90+% range of just simply getting households on landlines and being able to get a really well drawn representative sample of your population. Then, of course, we had cell phones, and the advent of cell phones about 20 years ago or so really had shaken up the polling industry. And I kind of like to think we're in kind of this time of the wild, wild west when it comes to polling in terms of figuring out, given the number of technology mediums that we have access to, And given the precipitously declining response rates on telephone, and what pollsters are actually doing about it. And so, we've noticed this decline in response rates that Dan had alluded to as well. And since 2016, now in the low single digits on average across the industry. So how do we actually reach respondents, whether we're talking about voters or people in the general population? How do we actually talk to them? And so a lot of pollsters nowadays have been turning to more mixed mode methods. And while telephone rates are declining, costs are skyrocketing, and it's incredibly difficult to get a completed survey interview with a respondent, we still see this balance and this need for part phone, but perhaps part other modes, given that different groups of people respond in different ways, better or worse, depending on how you actually contact them. So, we've moved to a mixed mode design. There's also the flourishing now of probability-based panels, meaning that panels are created much in the same manner as any survey would be drawn, but then these respondents are gone back to for subsequent surveys time and time again. As Don mentioned, we also, as pollsters, we sample off the registered voter file, but sometimes we do that through a combination of phone calling, both on landlines and cell, as well as text to web, meaning that we text respondents a link to a survey, which they then click on and go online to self-administer the survey. So there is kind of this wild, wild west of what are the proper proportions that we should be launching these different modes of recruitment and modes of interviewing in? What do we look to in terms of which groups respond better under which circumstances? Clearly, some groups will respond better by phone, some might respond better by email, some might respond better than by text. So it's trying to craft, and there's no secret sauce or secret formula here yet, but is trying to craft a design that really minimizes coverage error and making sure that that thing that Dan had mentioned earlier, and making sure that we're getting kind of this array within our study designs when we go to do these pre-election polls or otherwise, and using multiple modes perhaps to really have a better, more representative sample.
Thank you, Ashley. Alyssa.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Again, I'm with the Stockton Polling Institute, so I just wanted to start off by talking briefly about what we do at Stockton. We only do issue polling, so we don't do head-to-head candidate preference polls. We do probability-based sampling using random digit dialing or the statewide voter file, and we have a multi-mode approach with both live calls and text to web, so that approach that Ashley was just talking about. So some of our latest projects include deep dives on specific policies or issue areas like the state budget earlier this year, public health, energy policy or utility costs, AI, et cetera. Ahead of the 2024 election, we took a deeper look at the economy, immigration, and abortion because those were the issues identified as top issues in the national race for New Jersey voters. And we'll, of course, capture approval ratings for national and state leadership, candidate favorability, and things like that that are relevant to the election. Part of the reason I think the university made this shift years ago to focus on this issue polling is because I think the expectations from the public around those pre-election head-to-head questions have been really warped. I talked to so many people who have this impression that those polls are intended to be precise forecasts of what's going to happen on election day. And that's just not the case, as you just heard with some of the issues or some of the considerations you have to think about with polling. So I know we'll talk more about likely voter models and the variables that go into that and how changes in turnout from election to election can throw things off. And my fellow panelists who are doing that work are, of course, much better equipped to talk about the best approach there. So I just want to continue on that thread of talking about the inherent uncertainty in polls and how to understand the margin of error. So the margin of error quantifies the range of uncertainty around an estimate. And I'll talk about it in the context of candidate support, since I think that's where the public's expectations of precision are really heightened. So that margin of error goes in both directions for both candidates. If 50% of voters support candidate A in a poll and the margin of error is plus or minus 5, we can be pretty confident that the true value is between 45 and 55. And I think it's on us as practitioners to communicate that level of uncertainty. I saw in the latest Rutgers poll, I know, it was right there in the press release that the 5-point lead is within the margin of error. So that was great. It's great to see that we can communicate that in a way that's accessible to the general public to try to get that out there. And, of course, there are the margin of error doesn't account for these other potential sources of bias that you just heard about, coverage error, non-response bias. There are other limitations to be aware of aside from sampling error. And I know we'll dig into that more. I also just wanted to mention that the margin of error is much higher for subsets when the sample size is much smaller. So I sometimes see media narratives making some pretty grand determinations about specific subgroups of voters. And I don't know that there's enough data there to back that up sometimes. So you have to be mindful of those limitations. And finding a different result for a subgroup doesn't automatically mean that difference is meaningful or representative of the larger population. So again, I know we'll dig more into this with questions, but that was the element of polling literacy I wanted to highlight because I think it's a factor in why we focus primarily on issue polling, where we're studying a known population. We're studying the electorate overall or all residents, so we don't have those turnout considerations. And I think people have a greater understanding of the degree of uncertainty and more reasonable expectations there.
I think you make very good points about not having horse race polls, but we do. And so, and I've been covering them, probably frustrating pollsters for a very long time, and how I've been covering them for various news organizations, including the Star Ledger and NJ.com. And so we in the media and the general public were kind of addicted to them, and pollsters get hammered if the latest polls, show that the outcome of the race is different than what the latest polls show. And but tell me why we shouldn't use them as predictive and what we should use pre-election polls for.
So, Tom, the reason we shouldn't use predictive is because every time we start an election poll, we start with this wild hypothetical, like if the election were held today, we'd all be very surprised. Like, oh my God, it's Thursday. Like, what you can't just have an election today. So it's this wild hypothetical. We don't, as Don put, we don't know who the likely voters are. We're trying to sample a group of people that doesn't exist. We're taking a snapshot of a hypothetical group of people before an election. It's kind of miraculous that it works as well as it does. And if honestly, I tell people if it stopped working tomorrow, no one would be that surprised if it just stopped working. But what you can get out of it, and what is really useful, is actually what we call the internal validity side of it. That is, good polling can also say what is driving people to have one view or another view, what's driving them towards the candidates. And that's really useful because that's telling us not just who's going to win, because we're all going to find who's going to win at the exact same time, right? We're all going to be Tuesday night, we're all going to be sitting here and figuring out at the same time. But telling us why, that narrative, that's actually way more important. And that's potentially informative for voters and informative for the public in a way that most horse race polling really isn't.
I think it's also important to talk about people like you, Tom, our good friends in journalism. I'll give you a quick example just from today. Today, I released a poll on kindness in American society. To what degree do people practice small random acts of kindness? Do they think that people in their lives are as kind as they are? These are questions that each and every one of us deal with profoundly each and every single day. It matters to me how I treat others and how the others treat me. I got virtually no pickup on that poll at all. But if I come out with a poll later this week, whether it be on the New York City race, the New Jersey race, the Virginia race, I will get pickup from every single journalist up and down the Eastern Seaboard. So certainly they are addicted to it. And in order for us to remain as active pollsters, it's a luxury, and I'm envious of you if issue polling is you're able to succeed and keep your center up and running doing exclusively issue polling. We do a great deal of issue polling, but certainly the thirst, the hunger is who's up, who's down, and we have to, I think, recognize that, continue to do that work, and to do some of the work that Dan is pointing to explain the whys. To explain to people where the uncertainty is. But that's where the journalistic hunger is tell me what's going on in this race and tell it to me with as much precision and as much explanation as you're willing to do.
But Don, it's not just the journalists. They're not doing it because they think it's fun. They're doing it because that's what the public clicks on. Like the public wants that data, and to some extent, it's our job as public servants to give them the data they want, even if it's we wanted them to eat the broccoli and they want to eat the cake. That the horse race polling being the cake.
Well, Ashley and I wrote a paper years ago together. We call it the 4P process. And you're pointing it out. I mean, we sit amongst these 4Ps. The politicians are important to us, the public, the press, and the pollsters. We actually have the smallest megaphone, and we're nested within this process that is of interest to every one of those Ps.
To keep that metaphor going, and maybe I'll change it to spinach or something. The thing is, if we're putting out that vegetable, there's also the interpretation factor and the misinterpretation factor on behalf of the public and the media. And if any of us put out a headline, and even our headline yesterday saying there was a 5-point lead for Cheryl, but clarifying that it was statistically insignificant, we would see 10, 20, 30 different headlines interpreting that 5-point lead, some of which would ignore that it was within the margin of error. So, taking that veggie and turning it into some baked good and misconstruing it and maybe only putting a little bit of it in the recipe to really extend that metaphor here. Part of it is on the interpretation. We can give these data out into the world, but how they become interpreted sometimes is out of our hands as pollsters.
Yeah, it's like the way columnists don't write their own headlines, right? Like, I put out, our last one was Cheryl +7, and the New York Post headline was Cheryl in striking distance. Like, what? Where are you? Okay.
I also just wanted, to add just to Tom's point that pollsters are often get hammered at post-election. It's like there is no, these conversations are so great, talking about likely voter models, what goes into that, how certain decisions are made. They're so important because there's no conspiracy here. Pollsters are trying to get it right, and they're refining this model. They take in new information each election cycle. And so there's no malicious intent behind this. And I think that sometimes gets lost. It's, everyone is trying to continuously improve.
Yes,
and again, I'll just throw in one thing about polling literacy. It's difficult to be literate in polling, and it's hard to ask members of the general public, even if they are profoundly interested in politics, to spend the requisite time to take a look at each one of our polls and to see, well, what model did Rutgers use? How many seniors did they have in their model? It's so. Each poll has a model electorate that is a little bit different. Each methodology is a little bit different. So the best polls are ones that are fully transparent, that give all that information to any consumer of the polls, so that they can, if they want to, if they have the time to compare one poll to the next and see that some of the difference in estimates might be due to methodological decisions that one pollster made different than another pollster.
With that, how important is phrasing the question?
I always like to say, if you don't know how the question was worded, you don't know anything about the poll. That is the core of how people are interpreting what you're asking and how they decide to respond. Did you force them into a choice by just giving them a yes or no? Did you give them a scale? Did you say to them, tell me anything you want and I'll write all of it down? That is incredibly important to know how the question was asked. And I think, what's interesting here is that we actually have variations in how we even are asking about the race itself. We ask a very traditional, if the election were held today, hypothetical. Dan has started asking a definitely probably will vote for each of the candidates. So even the way in which we characterize something that seems so simple and not complex, like asking a head-to-head, we have different wording choices for it. And we know the power and the effect of wording and what we would call framing, what we would call priming, asking something, and then that affecting other questions. We know the effect of question order and formatting. All of that has a psychological influence on how respondents are cognitively processing and answering these questions.
So it's all scientifically put together in a way that seeks to get the right answers, the true feelings. It must be very frustrating when you see other polling operations that are doing this, push polls and the like.
Well, Tom, push polls don't really happen anymore, honestly. It's just not economically feasible. I mean, push
Yeah.
poll classically is I'm going to call up 100,000 people and try and get to change their vote. And
Right.
nobody picks up their goddamn phone. So it's not going to, you can't call that many people. It's not feasible. But I say there is a scientific process behind this, right? And so when I'm dealing with clients, one of the first things says, oh, we're going to write the questions. I say, no, you're not. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years. I don't write the questions, right? What we do is we write 5 different versions of the questions and send it over to a focus group for cognitive testing to make sure the question isn't biased, the question is understandable. There's also times where I've written questions that turns out the public had no idea what the heck I was talking about because I was using words they didn't know. Also, they're on the phone and they're not paying any attention to what I'm like. They're doing 3 other things. They're not paying attention, trying to write things at basically a 3rd grade reading level. So people can understand it, not because they're dumb, although some of them are, but not because they're dumb, because they're not paying attention when they're talking. It's a challenge, and it means that sometimes you wind up having these very lengthy explanations, which I hate because time is money.
I'm going to get off the horse race right now and just and talk about the actual races and what and you know the stuff that's away from the headlines that you all would prefer us to talk about and to discuss. What is the most important takeaway as far as attitudes and issues that you're seeing in your extensive polling on your races? Anybody just jump in.
So honestly, one thing that's really been striking about this election in particular is the extent to which voters do not know very much about the candidates. That voters have preferences, but they don't have a lot of information. And that's been really striking over the course of this campaign. We've seen this has not been a terribly informative campaign. Like political campaigns, in theory, are supposed to have a democratic end of, small d democratic, of informing the public. And boy, howdy, if that's what we're trying to do, we have done a poor job of it in New Jersey this year. And I think to some extent a poor job in New York this year as well, where voters just do not seem to have a lot of information about the candidates, and a lot of information they have just ain't so. And that's a real problem. And that's something that I think as pollsters is tough for us too, because it also means the answers become very unstable. When people don't know very much, they're actually learning from the poll as we're asking them questions. And that winds up shaping the responses. And you were just saying, oh, we're trying to get at the true attitudes, Tom. I actually don't think that's what we're doing. I think a lot of the attitudes we're picking up are things that voters are making up on the spot as we're talking to them because they've never thought about this stuff before. And that makes the responses much, much more unstable than they are when everyone knows exactly who the candidates are. I mean, attitudes about Trump are very stable. It's not a problem because everyone, unless you've been living under a rock in a cave on Mars, you know exactly what you think of Donald Trump. But people do not know what they think about Jack Ciattarelli. People do not know what they think about Mikey Sherrill because they just don't know these people yet, and the campaign hasn't really helped them.
I guess on the top issues, I mean, I don't think it would surprise anyone that affordability issues are top of mind always. Property taxes, cost of living, the economy in general. So we see them both talking about property tax relief. When we polled on various housing policies, property tax relief was the only one with bipartisan support. So it's not at all controversial for either of them. But aside from that, it's clear they're both leaning into partisan positions. And I think this kind of goes to Dan's point as well. Since people aren't as familiar with the candidates, they're probably going to vote on partisanship. And so the candidates understand that, and they're clearly trying to rally the base. They're not trying to change minds. They're trying to energize the base and turn out votes. So, for example, Ciattarelli's really been tying rising utility costs to Murphy and his energy policies. And he's talked about having a New Jersey version of Doge and cutting government here in the state. And our polling shows that these are positions that really only land with Republicans. For Cheryl, I think she has been a little more careful on the position she embraces because the Democratic base here is a bit more fractured and diverse than Republicans, I think. So she's counting on the Trump backlash to re-energize the Democratic base, and we're seeing strong opposition to Trump and the direction of the country borne out in the polls. So.
Well, certainly the New York City election is a little different because all due respect to Curtis Sliwa, you're really looking at 2 Democrats running against each other. And so this is a race that is going to have national implications for the Democratic Party. And in a sense, is going to measure within New York City the splintering of the Democratic Party between more left-wing, more progressive elements, and what has been the traditional focus of the Democratic Party for many years. So obviously affordability is a question, but in this election, it's who's going to be a more effective mayor in New York City. Zohran Mamdani, who's representing the new progressive wing of the party, backed by people like Bernie Sanders, backed by people like AOC, or Andrew Cuomo, who represents the traditional Democratic Party that's existed for, since Bill Clinton. In fact, in his debate performance, he traces his roots not just to his father, but to Bill Clinton. So we're looking at which Democratic Party, which Democratic leader is going to more effectively speak to issues of affordability, public safety, transportation, issues that are important not just in New York City, but nationally. So I think the New York City, or both races, I think are going to be analyzed extensively, not just for polling, but for what actually happens on election day.
Yeah, I think both of these races are going to set up a playbook for the 2026 midterms. And I think that's why there's all eyes across the country right now on both of these races in the tri-state area. And like Alyssa pointed to, some things never change. And we see the stability in, decades. We've been polling for over 50 years at Eagleton. In decades, it has been taxes front and center for New Jerseyans consistently. We actually sneak peek. We have utility costs have finally made the top problems list, although in the single digits that we'll be releasing on soon. And I would also say just an overall negativity and pessimism among New Jerseyans, much like the rest of the country, that has been increasingly apparent. And New Jerseyans, and I'm sure that citizens outside of New Jersey have the same perspective. New Jerseyans also have this thing where they understand the implications and the consequences of things like climate change and necessities that need to help the greater good. They just don't want to pay for it. And I think, combined with property taxes within the state, cost of living and affordability, New Jerseyans time and time again on a number of issues that are reflective of, bettering the greater good. They understand it needs to happen or bettering something like infrastructure. They just don't want it coming out of their wallets, and a real frustration with kitchen table and economic issues.
There are New York City and New Jersey are very distinct places. I'm going to ask for those who do the national polling, do you see any difference between what is important on a national basis? I know that Don, you do a lot of national polling with Trump and et cetera. Is there anything different, or are the New Jersey and New Yorkers their concerns pretty much the same?
Well, I think certainly there always are local issues. In New York City, the candidates are trying to get to issues that are specific to New York City in terms of crime in New York City, public services in New York City, public education in New York City, the issue of whether people are going to stay in New York City. There's ramifications between New York City and, of course, the state of New York as a whole. When we talk about tax policy, the New York City mayor does not make tax policy. The governor and the legislature make tax policy, yet New York City is reliant upon income from tax revenues for some of the programs that New York City would like. So, I think in New York City, of course, is different than many other places. New Jersey is a slight Democratic advantage, although it's a relatively representative blue state. New York City, there's about 7 Democrats for every Republican in New York City. So it's very different than a national election. But in this case, whereas I think in New Jersey, you still have the shadow of Trump. There's very little shadow of Trump in the New York City election, only insofar as which of the candidates feels as though they can do a better job either getting along with or standing up to the current president.
Yeah, I mean, just what Don was saying, New Jersey is actually demographically very, very similar to the rest of the country. We have almost exactly proportioned. The racial breakup of New Jersey is very, very similar to the country as a whole. Age distribution is pretty similar to the country as a whole. We're a little more educated, but then, y'all here in New Jersey, you know how smart we are. And we don't have any rural areas, which is actually the biggest difference between New Jersey and everywhere else. But it's actually very representative. And actually, was saying that people are going to be using this race in New Jersey as a playbook for the future, and that's not a bad idea. I mean, issues that resonate here, like electricity bills, resonate about the same. Affordability resonates about the same everywhere in the country. So it is very representative, and the differences are largely about the content of it and the extent to which rural voters are bringing in other opinions, because we just don't have any rural areas left in New Jersey.
To play off of Dan's comments, I mean, also we can see this in how the two candidates in New Jersey have moderated themselves. Cheryl obviously has had this persona as a moderate Democrat since she came into office in Congress. And even Chitterelli, despite the Trump endorsement and the explicit Trump endorsements throughout the general, has not really fed back into Trump during the general so far, and also has moderated some of his positions, like in the second debate, talking about recognition for immigrants and talking, in a slightly different tone about abortion. Like Dan said, we're a pretty purple state when it comes to our statewide and local level elections. And I think this shines through in what types of candidates get elected. And this is why we also in New Jersey see the success of both Republican and Democratic governors.
It's sort of what you're probably saying is that New Jersey is becoming a bellwether again. New Jersey was a bellwether for much of the 20th century, voting
I
the same way as presidential elections, with the exception of maybe two elections from 1920 all the way to 96.
Yeah, it's earning its moniker back again. I think it's legitimate this time.
I don't know. I think I'd push back in a little bit. I mean, the reason we tend to go back and forth between Democratic and Republican governors is just because New Jersey, the problems we have are so difficult to fix that no one's able to fix them. So every term was like, well, these guys couldn't fix the problem, let's bring in the other guys. And then they don't fix the problem either. We toss them out and bring the first guys back in. It is still because of the lack of rural areas, we are still significantly more Democratic leaning than other states. And, also the fact that we have such a high tax, high services state is in real contrast to much of the rest of the country. I mean, the amount of spending we have on education or on infrastructure in New Jersey would be unfathomable in 40 other states. So I think it's been overstated the extent to which New Jersey is trending Republican, especially in terms of voter registration. I think that's a little overstated. It is still maybe not as Democratic as it was, but still very Democratic. I think the big difference is we're much more polarized than we were. I've never seen North Jersey and South Jersey is much, much bigger than it ever was in the past. And South Jersey Democrats are on their way to being really an endangered species.
I know in the past, Ashley and I have discussed how issue-oriented polls and other things actually contribute mightily to our democracy because they can actually prompt leaders to act. Can you guys give me examples of that, or want to toss that out? Because there's more to it than how they feel about individual candidates and individual public figures. There's also very important issues that you guys poll on.
I know I've gotten, sometimes I'll put out issue polling. I think we have to understand elected officials by and large are a cowardly and superstitious lot, right? They are terrified that they're doing something that is unpopular. And so occasionally I've had 3 or 4 times the last couple of years where I put out a poll on an issue and it'll get calls from either people who don't like the poll or like the poll, telling me I should retract the poll. Like I should just say, no, never mind, I was wrong because it's bad for them or something isn't going to happen. Unfortunately, it's very rarely the effect we have is very rarely an effect I would like to have. But it is the effect that, telling the public officials what the public actually wants is powerful, especially on the state level, because state legislators really do not know what they're doing is, if it's popular or not, if it's going to make them lose an election. And they're scared. And that's a good thing. We want our officials to be scared of the public. But it means that polling can, if we poll at the right place, at the right time, on the right issue, can really have an outsized effect on what happens. Not always the effect we want, but it does bring the view of the public into it in a way that I'm not sure there's any other way for democracy to work that directly, at least not here in New Jersey.
We've certainly seen in New York, we call it the filibuster rule, that, on an issue, sometimes it takes quite a while for an issue to work its way through our legislature. Sometimes may even need a constitutional amendment. But take the example of the recent one of legalizing recreational cannabis. We were polling majorities in favor of that for quite a while. It wasn't until we crossed over the magic 60% of public opinion that the legislature then paid attention. We saw the same thing with same-sex marriage some years ago. We saw the same thing with having hydrofracking approved in the state of New York. That never made it to the magic 60%. So we do, public opinion measures those issues. In many cases, we measure it over time. We may ask the same question about one of those issues for several years. And sometimes change is slow. Sometimes there'll be a tipping point that's precipitated by various cultural or political events. But when we find that an issue gets to 60% public opinion in favor of it, that's when our legislature really pays attention. And maybe it's at that point that they get, they feel as though they have enough support that they're no longer afraid, Dan, and they can finally say, yes, we're for it. So we contribute to that. We measure it. And those are not pre-election polls. Those are the monthly polls that we put out month after month after month, measuring public opinion towards these important issues that affect, all citizens.
Yeah, there's certainly correlation. Maybe it's not causation, but certainly correlation. We've experienced it, much like Don said. We have also with same-sex marriage. A decade and a half ago, Eagleton put out an experiment in terms of framing it as gay marriage versus same-sex marriage, a huge jump when it was framed as same-sex marriage. And that was right around the time that the ball was going here in New Jersey in terms of accepting it. And we saw the same thing when it came to North Jersey Cassino expansion. So certainly it is the rare, and I'll get on my little soapbox about polling. It is the rare systematic quantitative tool that the public has to communicate what they think back to policymakers. We can have all the anecdotes in the world and in-depth media stories in the world, but we don't systematically know how a population feels the same way in which that population is actually represented in real life. And that's what polling can do. And it takes very little time, and often sometimes pollsters even incentivize, but it takes very little time to answer a poll. You don't have to take off of work to attend a rally, or you don't have to take time away from dinner or doing homework with your child to write a letter to a member of Congress. It takes very little time, and we recruit you to participate. So the lack of need of, resources for participating in the political process is a bonus. And so, and this also represents your voice in the most representative fashion.
I'll jump on Ashley's soapbox with her for 1 second and add another point that we do a fair amount of social and cultural polling at Siena as well. And folks have a tendency to think that most other people see and experience the world as they do. And another democratic small d effect of polling is that when we succeed in having a representative sample, we're able to tell everyone how many people who are very different from how they are feeling about the world, experiencing the world, and sort of shine a mirror to society and say, this is who we are. I mean, one thing that we poll quite a bit on is experience that people have with the discrimination. And you have to just, quickly look at our crosstabs, and you look at how the percentage of Black people who feel as though Black people are discriminated against versus the percentage of white people who think Black people are discriminated against are radically different. And that information is important to all members of society to see, to at least, if they can't climb into somebody else's shoes, at least to get a reflection of what it's like to live in their lives.
Yeah, I want to second everything everyone has said about the importance of polling. And I'll also just say that we always try to poll on issues that are relevant to the current policy landscape. So we're down here in South Jersey, we're in close proximity to the shore. So we, in the past, had done a lot of polling on offshore wind over time so that we could see those shifts. And I'll give another example. We're obviously experiencing a huge technological shift with AI, and our economy is probably going to change pretty rapidly. And so we started doing some polling on AI last spring, I believe, or maybe earlier, and we'll continue to ask those questions so that decision makers understand where the public stands. Because as of now, at least, there's not a lot of public buy-in for AI, and technology is certainly going to outpace legislation. So I don't know, that the polling will be used to put things in action quickly enough, but at least that information is out there. And industry leaders and decision makers know where the public stands. And right now, some of the top concerns are protecting jobs, preventing misinformation and deepfakes, and protecting personal privacy. So these are things that are important for decision makers to know.
Very good. I was supposed to remind everybody about 13 minutes ago that people can submit questions via Zoom and our Q&A function. And I think we're probably at a point where we can take some questions that are coming in. Let me see. Okay. And here we go. This is a question that and The most recent Eagleton poll had 795 respondents, which is less than a typical target of 1,000 to 1,500, producing a 5.7% margin of error. At what point does a smaller than optimal sample produce results that are not usable?
Yeah,
And
I think, oh, yeah, I see it, Tom. Do you want me to just dive in to answer the
yeah,
question?
dive in. Yeah, please.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think this brings up a really good conversation about constraints on polling and the reality of polling and time and budget, right? Obviously, we're diving headfirst into election day, and on top of that, polling is practically prohibitively expensive almost nowadays, and so it's trying to deal with the fact that people are answering less. We're using various modes of recruitment. You can see on this survey, we actually used recruitment by landline calling, cell phone calling, and cell phone texting to web. And especially within an election season, trying to target the right proportions of registered voters that we subsequently use in our likely voter model that are in proportion to the registered voter population in the state. So, time and money are huge factors when it comes to polling. It would be wonderful to talk to everybody in the target population. It would be wonderful to spend billions of dollars on it, and that's just not reality. We see, if you can kind of envision population size and margin of error, that margin of error pretty precipitously drops once we reach a few hundred cases for any target population. And so that's why you'll see that in a lot of polling on anything, you'll see maybe a sample size overall of 700, 800, sometimes bigger organizations will do 1,000, 1,500. And so, it's really the time money factor, and also kind of what do you need at that time. A lot of times when we're doing general population surveys and we want to delve into subgroups, particularly being able to look at both racial and ethnic groups other than that binary non-Hispanic white versus non-white, we will usually go for a population that's 1,000 plus. When we're trying to do these kind of pre-election polls, this is sometimes when our sample size might be a little smaller because of the aforementioned reasons, and simply, trying to get that data out. And so, I would say that's why we always report, as Alyssa had mentioned, how important interpreting the margin of error is, and especially that margin of error is bigger for the subgroups that we talk about. So that's why we always publish margins of error per subgroup in our press releases to kind of show you what that impact is. And typically for any single subgroup, we won't really delve into the details of that subgroup if they have a sample size of less than 100 individuals that actually talked to us, not once the weighting is applied, the statistical weighting, but actually talk to us. So that's when, if you have kind of a suboptimal subsample for a subgroup, that's when we kind of stop with the interpretation. But I would say this is why you typically see like 600, 700, 800 plus when you're looking at poll results.
And I was
Yeah,
just
I think you had
the way the calculus works out, because this is all calculus. The additional accuracy you get from a random sample of 800 versus a random sample of 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 is minimal. All you're getting out of that is a better opportunity to look at the subgroups. And honestly, the way the sampling is carried out, is so much more important to accuracy than the sample sizes. I'd rather have a great sample of 600 people than an awful sample of 2,000 people, or hell, the most famous polling failure in history. You have 2 million plus responses, but if the sample's bad, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think that's a question you'll see for the person that asks this question obviously knows a thing or two about polling, but for people in the general public, they'll say, how in the world can you figure out what America thinks with 1,500 people? There are 300 million people in America, and I know that it can't. I think it goes back. I guess because it go back to Gallup back in the 40s, where they realized that it didn't matter how many you polled, but who you polled.
Right. The key is to have a representative sample, and that, of course, ups the degree of difficulty, because some members of the population are easier to reach than are others. If you came in to our call center while we're in the middle of a state poll, for example, we'll take every state, we'll divide it up into regions. Each region will divide it up into groups of people by age, by political affiliation, and by race. So for a state, if we were doing New Jersey, we'd probably have 40 quotas to fill in a poll of 800 to 1,000. So the key is to be as representative as you possibly can. At least that's our view, and to do as little weighting after the fact as is necessary, because the weighting is always dangerous, and we all have countless examples of a weight being applied to a very, very small subgroup to make those people be representative, and that's where dramatic error can come in.
Another question, how can public institutions or media better communicate poll results to the public in ways that inform rather than influence voter perception and turnout? How can we tell us how we can do a better job?
Don't say that somebody's winning when it's 51-49
Right.
to all reporters from 2016. I think it's understanding the inherent uncertainty, like Alyssa had mentioned before, and it's paying attention to when we say things like it's within the margin of error, when we say things like it's statistically insignificant, and not to, Tom, not to pile it all on the media, because many of you are striving to do that and learning from the past decade of how do we talk to one another as pollsters and the press. And I would say, when we publish a graph with error bars, publish that too. Say in lay person's terms, what does the margin of error mean? Does that really mean that this result could actually be anywhere from like 54% down to 46%? So I think, incorporating some more education and some more uncertainty than taking these as etched in stone would go a long way, especially when we're talking about pre-election results.
Yeah, I think that's something I know I'm grappling with, and I'm sure a lot of practitioners are grappling with, is how to communicate that information in a way that is accessible to the general public. Like you said, Ashley, in layperson's terms. And like Don mentioned, even the impact of statistical adjustments, the design effect, these are all things that how can we better communicate that in a way that could be reported in the media? Because of course, the way that it's often put in a methodology statement is not something that you can really fit neatly into an article about the poll results. So it's something we definitely, I think, are all grappling with. How do we communicate that uncertainty in a way that's easy to understand?
I think we as a disciplinary organization have also done a poor job in many ways of sort of putting our hands together and explaining to the public how valuable we are. We think we're careful practitioners, and we do our work, and we speak to each other, and we release our polls. I've always, for years now, I've advocated that we as pollsters need to reach out to the public itself and explain why we are valuable, how we are a component of the democratic process that we all enjoy. We're not these evil, manipulative people who can make numbers say whatever we want them to say, that we're trying to contribute. Well, all right, Dan, speak for yourself.
We could. I mean, we don't, but we could.
But, we are trying to contribute to, our collective good.
And a good question here about how you rate independence. This is a Jersey question. What are they thinking about in New Jersey when it comes to report? How do you measure an independent? I mean, and you look in New Jersey, you see that there's X number of Republicans, X number of Democrats, and a whole lot of people who are not affiliated. But those people are not really independents, are they? How do you measure what an independent? What are they thinking?
So Tom, I'm much more skeptical than most people of independence. So you're talking about registration, someone who's not registered with either party. That is not someone who's independent.
Right.
Independence we typically define as someone who does not identify as a Republican or as a Democrat, and then follow up. If about a third of the voters can say, "Well, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat," great. If you then ask them, "Okay, but which way do you lean?" The answer is 2/3 of them say they lean towards one way or another. Those leaners, Republican leaners, are actually stronger Republicans than people who say that they're weak Republicans. They are just Republicans who know enough to say, I'm not supposed to say I'm a Republican, so I'm going to say I'm an independent, because independents are awesome and great, and we love independents. And the same with Democrats. So of the 1/3 of the population in New Jersey who are independents, 2/3 of them are lying and are actually just know it's social desirable to lie about this, and 1/3 of them are true independents who really don't care who wins. And I don't really care what they think, because they're not going to vote. Because if you're actually a true independent and you don't go on, lean to one side or the other. Voting is tough. Like you actually have to go in and like do research on every single candidate, decide who you're going to vote for. And I've been teaching college for more than 20 years. I can tell you, people do not like doing homework. Like we already can't get people to turn out and vote. So the idea where people are going to do their homework and then go out and vote. And some of you, I know that's you. I know that's some of you, and God bless you. But you're the weird one. Like that is really unusual. Independent voters, by and large, it's harder to vote. They don't do it as much. And if nothing else, it's probably rational to not do it because they're less likely to care who wins because, independent voters. If anyone wants to defend independent voters, go for it. But, I'm skeptical.
Someone here is asking about what you guys think of these betting sites. I mean, and I guess, and it's also part of a question that I had where everybody seems to fancy themselves as pollsters when you folks are doing the actual science and the actual hard data work, and you kind of get almost lost in the sauce sometimes if everybody has a poll out and then you have a poll out. How do you deal with that? Just
I would say the betting sites, by and large, there's lots of research on this, have not outperformed actual just polling. Part of that is because even though there's lots of people on the betting sites, they're betting for real money, they're mostly responding to information. So the big thing that happens, we put out a poll, the odds change based on the poll that comes out. That is not a sign that the betting sites have more information than we do. That's a sign the betting sites have less information than we do, and they're updating based on that. The other part is the betting sites, even though there's thousands of people, there's a limited amount of money in most of the American betting sites, and that means it's very easy to game. And we actually saw this in both 2020 and 2024, where fans of a particular candidate, to try and make them look better, can just spend a bunch of money. Look, $100,000 a lot for you or for me, but for some people, they can just drop that in order to make Donald Trump look like he's more likely to win. And you can just spend that money. And so it's much more open to people gaming it. And again, if you look at it, they are moving based on information coming in. They're not, if they really had privileged information, which the betting site is supposed to work, they know more than you do, then it would stay stable when my poll came out. It doesn't. It moves up or down based on that information, which tells you they don't actually have more information. It's much more vulnerable gaming, and the number of people in participating in them are just not great enough for the theory of them to work.
we have a question about the impact of Donald Trump on polling. Polling seems to have taken a different tack than last 10 years. Any thoughts about that?
Well, certainly we've seen in our national polling, in our swing state polling, that and it's a problem that our industry has been working with. There's a systematic tendency of ardent Trump supporters to respond to polls at a rate lower than the average general public. So if you take an example of if we're polling in the state of Pennsylvania, and we're polling central Pennsylvania, which we expect is gonna vote strongly for Donald Trump, and we get preliminary results and it's 65-35. We have to even question that, because the actual number might be closer to 75-77% for Trump. We have found that despite our rigorous attempts to quota individuals, whether it by income, by their party affiliation, by their trust in institutions, that it is just more difficult, especially in the areas where Trump has the greatest level of support, to get a representative sample of voters in that particular subgroup. So it's something that we're aware of. We've been experimenting with other variables that we can use in our sample in our questionnaire to identify those folks, to potentially weight by them. And we also have been experimenting with our sampling frame so as to increase the probability that we're going to have a sufficient representation of Trump supporters. So, when you have a leading candidate, now the President of the United States, who has made no bones about attacking the media in general, and we're perceived as a component of the media in many cases, that some of his followers are just not inclined to participate in polls. So added to the list of our challenges, we're certainly aware of it, and we're working on it.
One more question I see. We talk about the difficulty of trying to figure out who is actually going to vote when they tell you they're going to vote. Maybe they're not going to vote. But this sort of takes a different tack, which is if you attempt to find out how many people who are eligible may not turn out, and what does polling say about why people might not vote?
Uh, the biggest reason people don't vote, number one, if they don't is they're not registered. A lot of people aren't registered. The reason they're not registered is they say they don't know enough about elections, and I tell them you have no idea how little everyone else knows. They say they don't know enough, and also nobody asked them. And so if someone comes to your door and asks you to register, then you do it. Voters who do not turn out, the number one reason they tell us is they don't know who's going. They don't know enough about the candidates to decide who to vote for. I think actually mostly it's they do not feel engaged by the process. They don't see why this is relevant to them, so they don't see any big benefit to them in doing it. As we see, voter turnout goes up in more high-profile elections, down in lower-profile elections, because people oftentimes don't even know an election is going on. And that's especially a problem in New Jersey, where we don't have a whole lot of local media left. We're getting our media from New York or from Pennsylvania, and that means oftentimes they do not know what's going on in this race. A lot of voters in New Jersey, northern New Jersey, know more about the New York State mayoral race than they know about the New Jersey gubernatorial race. So they say they don't know. Also, voting is a habit. If you are a voter, you always vote. I'm a weirdo. I love voting. I get that sticker. I love that sticker, damn it. But that's just me, and I understand I'm a weirdo. Most people are not in the habit. If you're not in the habit of voting, you're not going to do it.
Okay, well, the clock tells me that we're at 1 o'clock. We have to an end, and I want to thank everybody. I'll go in Dan, Alyssa, Ashley, Don. For everybody, please take a moment to complete the survey, everybody watching, that will appear at the end of this webinar. For more information and to access a recording of this conversation, please visit eagleton.rutgers.edu. Thank you very much. And I would basically say that my internal polling says that you guys have all done a fine job today. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everybody.
I thank you.